Okay, so first of all, pleasure to be with you. I do thank you for the invitation. The history of childhood is one of my genuine scholarly passions. It's intriguing. It's never done enough. There's always something else to learn, so it's a pleasure to participate, however modestly, in that process. I thought that my most useful contribution to a conference focused on childhood in an interconnected world was to rehash and then complicate an argument about some of the basic changes that have occurred in childhoods very widely in the world, not universally, but very widely in the world, over the past 100 to 200 years. The chronology varies, as we will easily see. So what I want to do is initially lay out what I see as some core modern patterns of change. I confess they're not particularly surprising. I will try to make them vivid, but I'm not claiming here that I'm inventing stuff that you haven't thought about already. Then having done that, I want to complicate the picture a little bit by noting a number of embellishments within what I'm calling the modern patterns that I think in combination help shed light on changes that children have experienced, changes that those who deal with children have experienced, and in many cases are still experiencing, and connections, comparative connections that can help unite histories of childhood across disparate regions. Okay? So, here, to my mind, are the four basic changes. They're interrelated, ultimately, but four basic changes. First, and I say first, not necessarily because it was chronologically first, but because it commands attention most obviously. First was the substantial transition in modern societies from an emphasis on children as a source of labor, at least after a period of young childhood, to an emphasis on children as students. Schools increasingly replaced work. The transition was often difficult, depending, among other things, a bit on social class. It's a transition that's not entirely complete in the world even today. And various societies have sought interesting ways to try to mute the change by allowing schooling, but trying to figure out some ways in which patterns of work can continue. This was a feature, for example, of communist youth in Russia in the 1920s and 30s. But change number one, overall. In most pre-modern societies, most children were assumed to be sources of economic contribution for their families and societies. In most modern societies, increasingly, most children are seen as having a primary obligation to learn, or at least to go to school. I agree they're not entirely the same. Okay, so that's change number one. Change number two, pretty obviously, is a reduction in birth rate. This change, and again, I'm not trying to pretend that I'm telling you anything you don't know already, but let me get the cards on the table and then we can talk about embellishments. The ultimate decision to reduce birth rates connects, obviously, with the shift from work to schooling. As I tell my students routinely, they are economic liabilities. Their predecessors a couple of centuries ago were frequently economic assets. As families, and these were often, indeed usually, primarily family decisions, as families increasingly, sometimes a little bit slowly, realized that children's economic relationship to the family was changing, they almost inevitably, collectively, decided on a reduction in birth rate. And over time, a dramatic one. All right? Change number three can relate to the reduction in birth rate, but it also can be considered independently. And that is the literally, historically revolutionary reduction in children's death rates. The fact that at some point in most societies over the past literally century and a half, most families can now anticipate that their children will not die. Doesn't mean they don't ever die. It means, among other things, that when they do die, the shock, the emotional impact is often, frequently, virtually unimaginable. But on average, families do not anymore have to raise children that with the expectation that some percentage of them are going to die. And this will correlate, obviously, with the reduction of birth rate. As you have fewer children, you may become more anxious to see them live. As children live longer, or as children are more likely to live, you may also find your decision to have fewer of them amplified from this standpoint. And the final change, which is the area that I've probably done least on, but does warrant attention. It clearly relates, among other things, to the shift from work to schooling. The final change is that in modern societies, governments begin to take explicit interest in children, whereas in most pre-modern societies, with regard to most children, issues were left to parents, religious institutions, other agencies. Now the state takes a direct role. It takes a role in providing health support. It takes a role, obviously, in educating and in deciding what the content of education should be. It takes a role in intervening in other aspects of childhood. It becomes a significant factor. Okay, so 4 changes. Not unfamiliar. Why emphasize them? 2 basic reasons. First, these changes show up remarkably in a succession of regional and national cases from the late 18th, early 19th centuries on into the present. All right? Not surprisingly, and this is, I have to say, this is clearly a feature of my presentation of the modern pattern. Not surprisingly, the changes first began to show up in Western society, both in Europe, Australia, North America. Okay. They show up strikingly in reformed Japan. One of the first measures, one of the 2 measures initially taken by the Meiji government in the late 60s and early 70s of the 19th century was a massive new investment in public health measures designed, among other things, to reduce infant and child mortality rates, and the famous 1872 legislation that enacted universal primary schooling and primary school requirements. Took a couple decades to instantiate fully, but with remarkable speed, the Japanese began to replicate 3 of the 4 features that I've outlined as part of the modern pattern: protection of children's health, obligation of schooling, and obviously increased government intervention. Okay. The patterns show up strikingly again with the communist revolutions of the 20th century. Anybody who looks at the history of childhood in the Soviet Union, I think, whatever your other feelings about the Soviets, has to be struck by the rapidity with which the Soviets, as early as 1917-18, amid all sorts of other pressures, the rapidity with which the Soviets started trying to do 2 things. 1, provide additional health facilities for pregnant women and young children. In other words, to attack the problem of infant and young child mortality directly, and rapidly to expand the educational system. These were not brand new measures. The Tsarist regime had launched some hints of the modern patterns of change, but hadn't pressed them very far. The Soviets pick up, again, 3 of the 4 major features of what I'm calling the modern pattern very quickly. And the same applies to the Communist Revolution in China in the late 40s. Okay? The Communist revolutionaries obviously hoped to use what I'm calling the modern pattern to produce a somewhat different kind of child. The focus on children was partly because there was a hope that children could be reshaped into appropriate socialist citizens. So I'm not arguing that the process was exactly the same as what occurred in Japan or the West, but the basic features are remarkably similar. Okay? And then final example, familiar to many of you, somewhat less systematically, but certainly pretty clearly by the final third of the 20th century, most Latin American societies were making a conversion to universal schooling, a substantial reduction of children's death rates, increased government intervention in children's lives, and in this case, very clearly also, a substantial reduction in birth rates, which brought, for example, birth rates in a country like Mexico down from about 6.5 children per family as recently as the late 1950s to 2.5 by the 1990s, essentially completing the demographic transition. Okay, so point number one, I believe that the argument that these patterns are broadly shared across regions with differences in timing, I think is substantiated. It helps organize an initial set of comparisons about childhoods in places as otherwise different as France and communist China or Mexico. Okay? Point two is that underneath this easy to state pattern of modern change lie a number of really interesting decisions and connections that, again, are widely shared. Okay? At some point, parents had to decide, in most of the societies I've discussed, and in others besides, at some point over the past 2 centuries, parents had to decide to make at least an increased commitment to their children's schooling. Even if the state mandated schooling, parental input was frequently essential. That's a decision that didn't always come easily. It often occasioned great debate. At some point, and historians used to work on this, I think the interest has flagged, but I really think it's a fascinating topic. At some points, parents obviously had to make decisions about cutting the birth rate. Not easy. Involved choices about the mechanisms involved, but involved choices about deliberately departing from the patterns that had prevailed among your own parents. Sometimes it looks like mothers made the decision, often without fathers necessarily being fully aware. Okay? Other times, maybe couples shared the decision, but it's an interesting decision. My point is that these 4 basic changes, particularly the demographic transition changes and the schooling change, are not just, they're not just sterile artifacts. They involve real shifts in the way people thought about children, in the way children were expected to behave, and we're still working these changes out, even in societies where some of these changes have the longest lineage. Okay? Second, and let me just evoke this topic, the changes connect to other developments. Let me mention one that intrigues me. It's partly familiar, but I think partly actually deserves more historical attention. The reduction in birth rate obviously changed relationships among sibling sets within the family. There were simply fewer siblings to go around. Okay? By the same token, probably changed relationships between children and parents because there were fewer older children to serve as intermediaries between parent and child. Simultaneously, the rise of schooling placed an increased premium, and this is the familiar point, increased premium on same-age peers, okay, outside the home. The social horizons of the child change in ways that I think we could actually fruitfully explore a bit more, particularly on the sibling side. Right? So my second plea for attention to these modern patterns as the basis for global and comparative discussions. My second plea is the opportunity to extend the patterns into other aspects of childhood, into other aspects of adult life, in dealing with children. Okay? You don't have to stop with the brief description of the 4 changes alone. All right. So that's my first claim. Here's the obvious vulnerability. It's a modernization model, okay? I mean, when I've presented it in writing, for example, in the history of childhood, I don't usually use the word modernization because I get things thrown at you when you don't have to, but it's a modernization model. It's an argument that in most modern societies, the dynamics are such, partly because of imitation, particularly as global connections increase. It's an argument that in most modern societies, children and childhoods will undergo some very basic common patterns of change that are significant and have wide ramifications. Okay? That's true. But I'm also cognizant of the many weaknesses of the modernization model. And the second part of my remarks are really designed to address some of these vulnerabilities, not to throw out the first part of my talk, okay, but to admit that it has to be modified. Okay, two obvious challenges, which I'm not going to deal with extensively, but I want them noted for the record. Challenge number one, the patterns of modern childhood obviously do not apply everywhere. There are zones in the world still where, because of extreme poverty, patterns of disease, and most commonly civil strife, the modern patterns do not fully apply, or in some cases, as in Syria, as in Iraq, as in parts of Africa, have been actually reversed, with increases in infant mortality and so on. So I think actually these different patterns in their own perverse way illustrate some of the utility of the modern model by way of contrast. But I do want to note, I'm not claiming that this model is universal. Widespread, but not universal. And exploring the cases where the model doesn't fit at all is truly important. Second, and I will get into this a little bit, but not as elaborately as I should, so I want to note it explicitly. One of the problems with the modernization model of anything is that it tends to assume that pre-modern societies were all alike. Well, when it comes to childhood, as to some extent we just heard in the previous presentation concerning the Middle East, they're not all alike. So any sophisticated use of the deployment of modern patterns, particularly for comparative purposes, clearly has to take into account the variation in traditions on which modern change was imposed. Easy point, because we see it all around us in the world today. Some societies had cultures that were more easily adaptable to childhood as schooled childhood than other traditions. Okay? East Asian societies, to touch on a point I'm going to bring up later, East Asian societies have had an easier time converting traditional uses of shame to pressures for success in school than has been true in India. Indian society has a deep shame tradition, and it has significant student accomplishments, but it hasn't made this transition, according to a number of comparative studies of shame in the two regions. Okay? Different societies will more easily or less easily accept increasing government role in childhood. So, important point, which I'm not ignoring, but I'm not building into an elaborate statement. Any use of the modern patterns of change in childhood has to recognize that it starts from different bases. Okay? And I think that's a fruitful invitation for more sophisticated comparison, but it is meant to recognize very clearly that I'm not ignoring significant differences with regard to approaches to children in different cultures before modern times. Okay. Here are the complications that I want to address a little bit more elaborately, though in a couple cases they do relate to this difference in pre-modern traditions point. In the first place, pretty obviously, while I think the four changes that I've outlined are of primary importance, there are some other ones, at least by the 20th century, that are reasonably general. Okay? Many societies by the 20th century are impacted, at least to some degree, by new ideas about children's rights. These bear some relationship to the modern patterns I've described. Children's rights, for example, almost always include provision of education. They almost always include adequate health protections, so they're not unrelated to the changes I'm talking about. But the specific notion that children have rights, I think, is a useful addition to the overall modern pattern. Even more striking, because it's not in my four categories clearly at all, even more striking by the 20th century, or in some cases even the late 19th, even more striking is the increasing need in many societies, particularly in the cities, to make some new calculations about children as consumers. Okay? That's an issue for children. It's often an issue for children's identities against parents. One of the roles of modern consumerism is to let children annoy their parents in new ways. Okay? And it's a category for parents themselves. Actually, one aspect of the history of parenting that I think has been insufficiently attended to is the adjustments parents have tried to make to deal with how to encourage, regulate, utilize increasing consumer opportunities for kids. Okay, so point one, any use of the modern model has to be open to subsequent embellishments, some of which may also be to some degree global in scope, but they add to the complexity of the overall model. Okay. It's also worth noting, and in some cases consequential, that while I am obviously wedded to the notion that there are four basic changes, they don't always occur in the same sequence, and that may be worth some attention. The outlier is birth rate. Okay? In the West, birth rates began to drop before death rates substantially dropped. So you get a nice, tidy Western pattern where schooling begins to go up, not always as rapidly as we assume, but it begins to go up. That in turn has an impact on birth rate as families increasingly realize that their children are converting from asset to liability. And then subsequent to that, particularly in the decisive decades 1888 to 1920, okay, subsequent to that, the infant and young child death rate begins to plummet dramatically. Okay? That's not the common pattern in other parts of the world. Common pattern in other parts of the world is schooling begins to replace work, a lot of effort to reduce the infant death rate, thanks to government public health measures and, in many cases, new parental efforts. But the government doesn't encourage birth rate reduction at all. So it occurs later in relation to the other changes than was true in the West. Okay? Hence, for example, in societies like the Middle East and Africa today, tremendous, even though the birth rate is now dropping rapidly with government encouragement in places like Iran. Okay? You have a longer persistence of a massive children and youth bulge in the society than was true in the West, with consequences that we're trying to figure out, anticipate, and worry about. Okay? So, the changes that I refer to as modern patterns don't occur at the same time, and particularly with regard to birth rate, they don't occur in the same order, and that can introduce some interesting comparative complexities that are worth attention. Okay. But the big comparative set that I want to address, not because it's comprehensive, but just by way of a few illustrations, the big comparative set that I want to address are aspects of childhood that I think fit within the modern patterns that I've described, but take obviously different dimensions, or may take obviously different dimensions in different regions of the world, depending, among other things, on prior culture. So let me start with one that's not up there, should have been, just forgot it. Okay, gender. The implications of the modern patterns of childhood, on the whole, aim at reducing, not eliminating, the significance of gender markers among children. As women are destined decreasingly as simply as childbearers, given the anticipated reduction of birth rate, as other roles are identified for women, and particularly, as it turns out that girls can do very well in school, thank you, the gender differentiation that was characteristic of more traditional societies, and in the early stages, even modern societies, the gender differentiation logically decreases. I think that's a fair statement. But quite obviously, at least at the present time, different societies continue to remain attached to rather different statements about gender. The West seems to have adjusted, for whatever set of reasons, reasonably calmly to the fact that with a reduced birth rate, More parents are likely to encounter children of just one gender, okay, than is true in East Asia or India. So gender is, I think, affected by the modern changes I've delineated, but not defined by it. Different cultures take different specific tacks. Now, maybe over the long run, some of these differences will ease. Okay? Over time, the Chinese may reduce their emphasis on the importance of having a son. Okay? I'm not predicting that. It is, however, possible. I'm not trying to use the modernization model to predict, but it's obviously possible that it will. Okay? So gender is a variable. Adolescence is intriguing. And here I'm merely meaning to evoke a topic that others have evoked, urging comparative study, but we really haven't seen the comparative studies very much yet. We know that adolescence was an important artifact of Western childhood in the later 19th century. It reflected extended schooling, it reflected reduced work roles, it reflected changes in sexual maturation. Adolescence summed up a number of developments. And while I think we emphasize adolescence a little less strongly than was the case 100 years ago, we still use the concept, whether we use the word or not. Do other societies, as they experience modern changes, also experience a somewhat comparable adolescence? Paula Fass, for example, has frequently raised this question. I honestly believe we haven't answered it, among other things, because we haven't paid enough attention to the relevant aspects of the history of childhood in non-Western societies. It's intriguing that in the year 2000, the word teen was introduced into Vietnamese. Okay? And there's now a Vietnamese word, teen. Okay? It simply means a teenager who is an avid consumer. And a teen is an adolescent who's an avid consumer plus. Okay? I don't know whether that suggests a larger pattern of adolescence. My guess is there's some comparative differentiation probable here, but it's an invitation for, as I suggest, additional work. Children's rights have obviously been defined differently in different societies in the 20th and 21st centuries. Some societies are slower than others to give up on the notion that children might still legitimately be required to work. This is one of the reasons that the Children's Rights Charter of 1989 really took a fairly cautious stance toward child labor, forbidding only the extreme forms of child labor rather than attempting a systematic prohibition, which agencies like the International Labor Office have been working toward for a long time. All right? I think an interesting difference has opened up more recently between European, or at least some European and American definitions of children's rights. Americans are pretty good, at least on paper, on those children's rights that are protective. We have the most elaborate safety apparatus for children in the world. We're not so hot on children's rights that allow children to express themselves against adult wishes. That aspect of children's rights, which began to be identified by children's rights leaders in the 1920s and 30s, that aspect of children's rights has moved farther in Scandinavia, Britain, and some other West European countries than it has in this country. Another invitation for comparative attention. But here's the comparison, and I've got the basic statement and then two sort of consequences of this. Here's the comparison that intrigues me the most. Okay? One of the complications in dealing with the modern changes in childhood without becoming captured by a purely Western model, one of the complications, in my opinion, involves recognizing that as the modern patterns of childhood began to emerge in the West, they were accompanied by an additional set of cultural changes that were not inherently attached to the model. Here's what I mean, okay? So at about the same time, roughly speaking, at about the same time that Western societies began to emphasize schooling a bit more, began to cut the birth rate, began to see the state step mildly into the issue of regulating child labor, at that same point in time, Western culture also began to become increasingly interested in the child as an individual. Okay? Western individualism is often referred to. I think we sometimes don't actually sit down and say, well, when did it show up? I think recent work, particularly on Britain, suggests pretty clearly, while there may be hints of Western individualism in the Renaissance and Protestantism, it's really not until the later 18th century that Western individualism kicks in. Okay? It's not initially applied primarily to children, but ultimately it is. Okay? And from the late 18th century onward, you see a series of increasing steps, first in the middle class, but then in other groups, a series of increasing steps that are meant to identify the child as an individual to a much greater extent than had been true in Western society previously. Example from the late 18th century is the change in naming practices. Increasing efforts to find, at least in principle, novel names for children. It turns out, of course, that child naming is tremendously faddish, so names, I'll tell you the mistake I made with my oldest daughter. I thought Deborah was an unusual name. How really stupid. But anyway, okay, we strive for individualized naming and have now for a couple hundred years. Okay? Significantly in the later 18th century, and this one's intriguing, students love it. Significantly later 18th century, Western families began to stop using names, reusing names of siblings who had died. Okay? Names are attached to individuals, you don't reuse them. And individuation in Western childhood would continue with practices, for example, not like in the later 19th century, like new sleeping arrangements designed to encourage children to sleep individually. I'm not sure that was a good idea, by the way, but it's a marked pattern. Ultimately, by identification of separate rooms for children. There's a great book, in my opinion, coming out from the University of Chicago Press this fall called Get Out of My Room, which is an intriguing study of how American teenagers identify the individual room as theirs, and it becomes deeply attached to their individual identity. Okay? So, Western society, perhaps particularly Anglo-American society, Western society began to do a number of things that placed increasing emphasis on trying to identify the child as an individual, encourage individualism, okay? And in the Western history, this became obviously totally wrapped up with the other basic changes, okay? But they're not inherently attached. So, though we don't know as much about this as we should because it has not been tackled comparatively systematically, East Asian society pretty clearly, or at least some segments of East Asian society, pretty clearly made a decision. The modern model is great, or at least it's inevitable. We're going to implement that, but we don't want this individualism stuff. Okay? Some of you are familiar, I think the case that's best developed, though it's not as intimately connected to actual childhood history as I would wish. Some of you are aware of the patterns that developed in Japan in the 1870s and 80s when the Japanese first got the excitement about educating children and redefining childhood and even paying more attention to childhood as a phase of life in a pattern not dissimilar to the one that Arias used to claim for the West. Okay? They went through about 5 or 10 years in which they assumed that the whole Western package had to be imported. So they brought in educators from the West, they brought in a minister of education from Rutgers, and for several years in the 1870s, it looked like Japanese schooling might replicate the then existing patterns in Western schooling that at least had some identifiable ingredients that were meant to encourage individuation. But literally around 1880, the authorities around the Meiji Emperor decided that this tack was inappropriate for Japan. It was inconsistent with Japanese traditions. It was incompatible with political stability in Japan, which needed more emphasis on loyalty, more emphasis on group cohesion. So the Western advisors were tossed out. Translations of Western works on education and social science were increasingly limited. Still, Western science and technology were still great. But the social aspects of the Western package were now counterindicated. And from that point onward, Japan has been, on the whole, a pretty successful example of a clearly modern pattern of childhood that does not build in the same degree of Western emphasis on the child as an individual. That is much more careful to inculcate group values, okay? Much more careful to inculcate and emphasize a sense of loyalty, and down the line. Okay? This differentiation shades over, or perhaps can be further illustrated very briefly, by differing patterns concerning the role of shame in childhood. Okay? Part of Western individuation with regard to children involved an increasing attack on the use of shame in child discipline, okay, as incompatible with trying to raise self-respecting individuals, incompatible with individual dignity. It was associated with a concomitant attack on the use of shame in public punishment. Okay. Stocks were outlawed in Massachusetts as early as 1804. Okay. Now, as anybody knows who grows up, who has been a child, you never eliminate shame from childhood, among other things because children delight in shaming each other. But there has been a fairly consistent effort in American and Western society, again for the past 200 plus years, to reduce and reprove shame's role in childhood. Okay? And this has included systematic efforts to find alternative methods of discipline. The desirability of encouraging children's self-esteem was mentioned in an American child rearing manual as early as 1856. Okay? Now, the big self-esteem movement is half a century old. I'm not claiming that this caught on immediately, but Western society has worked pretty hard, and with at least some degree of success, to limit the use of shame as a formal disciplinary tool among children and to seek alternatives. This has not been the case in East Asia. Shame has been modified a little bit in the late 1950s. The Japanese abandoned the practice of having errant children stand out in a school hall where they would be singled out for shaming. So they've increasingly eliminated hauling as a shame mechanism. So the blatancy of some shaming mechanisms has decreased, but the heavy reliance on shame persists. Okay? A poll taken about 8 years ago involving Chicago parents and Taiwanese parents. A poll asked parents the following question: is severe shaming an appropriate response to children's misbehavior? Okay. 49% of the Taiwanese parents said absolutely. 0% in Chicago. That doesn't mean they didn't shame in fact, but we've developed different patterns. Both work. Okay? I have a sneaking suspicion that if you want children to do well in math, shaming may work better than self-esteem, but that's a personal opinion, okay, and doesn't take into account other potential consequences, okay? So the differentiation between Western patterns of individuation in approaches to children and approaches in other regions, in terms of what I know, most clearly East Asia, but the issue needs to be addressed in other cases as well, including the Middle East, as was suggested in the previous presentation. Okay? I think is a really interesting illustration of the fact that you can do modern childhoods in different specific ways, and the invitation to further comparison is, I think, intriguing. Okay? I think the same, and let me simply state this very briefly, I won't try to elaborate, we can take it up in discussion if you want. I think the same differentiation needs to be applied to the idea of childhood as a happy period of life. Okay? Kicked in pretty clearly in the West by the later 19th, early 20th centuries. It's not a traditional notion, probably not even a useful notion if you sit down and look at it carefully. What's been the international response to Western emphasis on children's happiness? Okay. Influenced by it to some extent, concerned about it in other respects. A number of Muslim societies, for example, have discussed the appropriateness of having birthday celebrations for children. Okay? Might distract from appropriate religious observation. Okay? It's not an automatic. It's another one of those cases where you can go in several potential directions while still constructing a basically modern pattern of childhood. Okay? So my biggest complication to my effort to emphasize the utility of a modern pattern, my biggest complication is there are all sorts of comparative issues that dance between the poles in these patterns. Okay? 2 final points. Another common objection. Okay, so modernization, whether it's applied to childhood or not, modernization is typically objected to because it's too Western. I've tried to indicate that I think you can do a non-Western, a Western neutral model of modern childhood and then build some of the other aspects into more sophisticated comparisons. Modernization is objected to because it's too Western, because it ignores different traditions in different societies. Okay? And I've at least tried to suggest that I think those criticisms can be applied to embellish and complicate the modern model without necessarily destroying it. And finally, modernization is most typically attacked because in so many hands it has been blindly optimistic. Okay? And we had, for those of you who've dealt with the history of childhood for more than a couple of decades, we had a period in the history of childhood in the United States where a number of practitioners were going around saying that only in the 20th century have we learned how to treat children properly. Well, that's absurd. Okay? So you complicate undue optimism in 2 ways. One, you explore pre-modern patterns to indicate that they often had great success and validity. They're not all bad, they're different, but they have advantages. And second, and I think here too we could do more systematic comparative work as part of exploring modern childhoods. You take a look at some of the obvious downsides of the modern experience for children itself. Okay? Obvious example, increased schooling requirements have began to generate clear anxieties among some children, as early as the 1850s, when a German novel pretty clearly identified what we would now call attention deficit disorder, though the formal category was introduced in the 1920s. Japanese children, a significant minority of them, suffer from school attendance anxieties called hikumari. They just won't go. Okay? And we're all familiar in this country with many of the stresses that children encounter as part of schooling. Schooling replacing work is not a uniform blessing. Okay? So we need to take, as a further embellishment of the modern model, we need to take a careful look at modern drawbacks. I think particularly psychological, but other issues may arise as well. Okay. And then one final point, which in a way does get back to a modern model, particularly its demographic implications. Okay. As modern children became decreasingly useful to families, ultimately, by the way, clearly in this country, but also in East Asia, reducing the number of chores they accomplished, quite apart from no longer working outside the home. As modern children became economic liabilities, as some of the definitions of appropriate parenting became more complicated, as the birth rate dropped, in modern societies, we increasingly realize children become optional. And particularly in the last several decades, in places like the United States, but even more markedly Japan, the number of couples who deliberately decide not to have children goes up intriguingly. I'm not faulting, it's just interesting. Because here's the most interesting final point about the modern model, and it can cut in 2 different directions. With the modern model, particularly the reduction of the birth rate, with the modern model, the percentage of children in society goes down pretty dramatically. Okay? In agricultural societies, children usually constitute upwards of 42% of the entire population. in the United States in the middle of the baby boom is already down to 30%. It's now 22% and dropping rapidly. Okay? As children become a less significant segment, two possible results accrue. One, children become rarer and therefore more precious. Viviana Zelizer has a great book called Pricing the Priceless Child, which directly traces the process of how middle-class American parents began doting on children as they had fewer of them. But children as a decreasing segment of society also can lead to less attention, more competition with other age groups, particularly the elderly. Okay? I think a really interesting issue in places like the contemporary United States is precisely trying to figure out the best response to this ambiguous implication of modern childhood. Do you pay more attention to the children you have? Are you willing to pay attention not only to your own children, but to children in other groups, which I would argue we're doing a very bad job of currently? Okay? Or do you suggest that children simply aren't as significant anymore, which in some ways is really true? Okay? I end, therefore, with a modern question. Okay, and thank you very much.
You were talking about the children in the global sense, from work to the transition from work to schooling,
yes.
You said. What I was thinking, if we were to have a worldview that is embracing the entire human race rather than just compartmentalizing it, East versus West, I was thinking, to what degree does the multinational corporations play the role of from work to school in transition in the global sense? Because now our materialistic world is based upon, as you said before, that children in the West are more consumers, where children in other parts of the world are really producers. We know that for a fact.
Well.
So
no.
when we have the cheap production and affordable consumption coming together, so to what degree do the multinational corporations have the responsibility to see that the children around the world are no longer slave laborers, but they too make the transition from work to schooling?
Okay. Let me I'll try to answer, but a slight caveat. Most children in the world today, at least before mid-teens, no longer work. It's not the majority experience. Okay? So increasingly, I think we face the dilemma of dealing not with so much non-Western regions, which in some cases have rapidly moved into the schooling model, but of deprived categories in many societies, particularly, I admit, the most impoverished. So just a little modification, okay? I think the notion of children's rights as including the opportunity for adequate access to an adequate education, I think those rights should be taken seriously, and as multinationals can help promote that, I think that's all to the good. My understanding is that the actual use of child labor in multinationals is lower than average. The problem that multinationals generate is in subcontracting and in putting pressure on more traditional enterprises, and this has been particularly apparent in South and Southeast Asia, that generate increased or at least maintained adherence to child labor. So I think the multinational role can be emphasized. I think it's also, however, important to acknowledge that it's a little bit complicated because directly they're not the worst villains.
Thank you. Alongside that point, my question is, do you think that there could be an effect of this push towards a modernized vision of childhood in these economically challenged countries to, for example, use child labor in order to help promote the paradigm of modern childhood. For example, I'm from West Africa, and in a lot of households, the children of the family may be encouraged strongly to engage in education so that they can one day enter a modern workforce. However, other children of other groups and other families are being used as domestic laborers in that house in order to take care of that other child and kind of to do the work that you suggested was traditionally done with children.
Sure. Okay, look, you were obviously right. So I'm not disagreeing with it at all. The only thing I would note historically, and I don't mean that this is encouraging, but the only thing I would note historically is that every society that began to push for more schooling went through this phase for a while. The highest use of children, defined as people under 18, the highest use of children in the United States was in the decade between 1910 and 1920. Okay? The middle class had long since pulled its kids out of the labor force. But the working classes were still contributing child labor like crazy. That doesn't mean that you're not right, there's a problem. It doesn't mean that the African pattern will solve itself with further modernization. But I just want to note that the issue state is genuine, and most societies have undergone it, which invites another kind of comparison. Okay? But again, absolutely right.
Peter, I wonder if you could comment on two developments that strike me. One is the ever-expansive use of the word child to refer to people that no one in the past would ever have called children, and to a certain extent the actual reality of treating them as dependents, that is, growing numbers of college-age and even post-college-age students treated not as independent agents who are capable of supporting themselves and should be independent of their parents, but rather as if they were still children who require a degree of parental oversight, whether by their own parents or by institutions that we put them in. And then the second is the bifurcation or increasing differentiation of the experience of childhood within Western societies between those where there is extreme parental investment in their development and those where, for financial reasons largely, there's much less investment.
Yeah. Okay. So a crucial issue, and I've glided over it. Okay, let me deal with the second one first. A crucial issue in exploring the so-called modern model further would be to acknowledge significant social class differences. Okay, and I fully admit this. The middle class, obviously, has latched on to the modern model more readily than other social segments. Okay, we know this. It's important. Indeed, I think one of the essential attributes of the middle class is its ability to adopt and adapt to the modern model particularly successfully. Okay, so you have an ongoing issue, and it's a real one. Of the extent to which other groups are sort of pushed into elements of the modern model, but either because they lack the means or because they haven't made the cultural adjustment, they don't actually participate in quite the same way. There's a really interesting book, this is illustrating your point from a different country. There's a really interesting book from the 1970s on the affluent worker in Great Britain. At that point, factory workers in Great Britain were often making quite a bit of money. And if you ask them what do you want your children to be, their answers were almost the same as the middle class. We want them to be doctors, lawyers. We don't want them to do what we want to do. But if you then follow up and say, what are you doing to help your kids in school? They weren't doing the same thing at all. So it's, yes, the most tragic situation is where the economic circumstances of the family, often involving single parenthood, just don't allow participation in educational support. But I do think there are class cultural issues in some cases as well. Okay? All right, so the first question you asked, I love it. I don't try to build it into the kind of global discussion I was undertaking because it may be so peculiarly American, although there are hints of it in China. Okay? And that is the overprotective parent. Okay? As you have fewer children, the temptation to intervene increasingly goes up, but I think in the United States, and this is another lecture, Okay? And this is one that I've been trying to figure this out for 2 decades. Something happened in the United States in the 1970s and 80s to make American parents particularly fearful about their kids. Okay? Do we have time for a quick example? Okay. In 1982, okay, rumors proliferated, stories proliferated, that children were being poisoned by their neighbors when they went trick-or-treating. Okay? So ever since then, we have not let our kids go trick-or-treating by themselves. It's a horrible job as a parent. It's really boring. Okay? But we dutifully trot around after our kids. Okay, fascinating thing. Those things never happened. There were no razor blades in apple. There was no poison candy. Something was going on to make American parents easily convinced that the environment was against them. And we've been operating on that assumption ever since. We don't let our kids travel the way we used to. We drive them to the school bus stop. I mean, it's bizarre. So, yeah, it has 2 effects. One is it makes parenting much less pleasant. Okay? Of the 22 countries recently studied in terms of are parents less happy than couples that don't have children. Okay? The United States is dead last by a margin. Several countries have parents happier than non-parents. Okay? A number of countries are pretty even. The United States is way down, and I'm convinced that the reason is A, policies that provide inadequate support for parents, for example, in parental leave, but B, a level of fear and anxiety that is absolutely incommensurate with the facts. And consequent number 2, as you've indicated, is a certain number of kids, I mean, I think most college kids are doing all right, but a certain number of kids whose parents continue to intervene, who arguably suffer from psychological anxieties, which have measurably gone up among college kids, and who definitely, if they grow up at all, grow up later. It's not dissimilar to what happened in the 19th century with the high school age, where they became more dependent. But I think the pattern among college kids has other dimensions, as you properly suggested. So I think it's an intriguing topic. As I say, I just hate to try to pretend I can put it in a global perspective, except in saying that there do seem to be a few comparative indicators that American parents have some self-created troubles that we really need to take a look at.
Not sure how to start this. I'm a parent of 4 children. All have gone through, graduated. One of them graduated from the University of Maryland. And if I had had a nickel for every time I was told by a teacher that your son really isn't going to make it, he's not very smart, and you need to accept that as a parent. Coming to find out that my child had significant learning disabilities, that the schools pretty much, they said he was lazy, he was this, and had I accepted that fallacy and continues it, that kind of fallacy continues in our school systems now. These children are seen as, well, we'll just put them on, all children are not intended to go to college, so let's make sure that they can, go get a career and technical job. And if parents are sold that idea that we're getting kids on going on certain tracks, then we're also not looking at the obvious. And considering that the school systems have been functioning at least for the last 50, 60 years under the same model, we don't really get to see, and I don't think it's always just about behavior, or I think there are some other societal things that we've already tracked these children to be a certain way. And I just think we need to change how we see education and working with children.
Okay. And I mean, not to make an artificial connection, I think this is one of the challenges that the so-called modern model creates. Some kids fit into the school orbit more easily and readily than others do. And we do have trouble making adjustments. I agree with you. Okay, so that's a kind of issue that would not have arisen in a pre-modern situation where schooling was less systematically important. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions? I was interested that you were saying if you consider childhood to be 18 years and younger, and I wonder if there really is an international agreement on that. We went to live in Nigeria in 1976, and when we got there, we found out that adulthood began at 12. That, you know, living in a non-Western culture, that varies greatly. I know that I believe in the Jewish faith and in the Baha'i faith, the age of maturity is 15. But anyway, I think it's really an interesting question.
Sure.
What is a child? What age
Sure.
group defines a child?
Sure. Yes, agree with you. Interesting comparative topic. I think even there would be some, on the whole, differences between societies that have moved into the modern pattern. They would tend to have extended the age because of extended educational requirements. But even then, it's not uniform, and I agree it's an interesting topic. And certainly suggests different definitions of maturation from agricultural or pre-agricultural societies to modern industrial societies.